That flagpole, she screeched, the sound grating like sand in a gearbox, is a violation of Section 12, subsection C, paragraph 4 of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the steam warm my face in the cool morning air. I remained seated in the wicker chair on my own porch, looking out over my own lawn. From my vantage point, I could see the freshly dug hole, perfectly circular, about 12 inches in diameter and 3 feet deep, its edges sharp and clean. Beside it lay a pristine 20-foot white aluminum flagpole and a neatly folded American flag, still in its triangular presentation box from my retirement ceremony. "Brenda," I said, my voice intentionally low and calm, a counter-frequency to her shrill transmission. "We've been over this. My property is not, nor has it ever been, part of the Bayside Meadows Homeowners Association." Brenda Miller, president of the aforementioned HOA and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood aesthetics, puffed out her chest. She was a woman built like a fire plug, clad in a lurid pink tracksuit that strained at the seams. Her face, usually a mask of pinched disapproval, was flushed a blotchy red that clashed horribly with her outfit. "It doesn't matter," she squawked, jabbing a finger tipped with a dangerously long acrylic nail in my direction. The gesture had no real heat behind it. It was pure theater. "It is visible from the community. It affects the visual harmony and property values of Bayside Meadows. Therefore, the HOA has jurisdiction over its placement and specifications." I took another deliberate sip of coffee. I had been a colonel in the United States Army Corps of Engineers for 30 years. I had negotiated land use agreements with stubborn tribal elders in hostile territories and explained structural load tolerances to belligerent warlords. The concept of jurisdiction was not something I was fuzzy on. "That's an interesting legal theory, Brenda," I said, setting my mug down on the small table beside me. "It's also completely, unequivocally wrong. The visibility of an object does not confer legal authority over it. My neighbor can see my roof. That doesn't give him the right to tell me what color to shingle it." Her eyes narrowed into furious slits. "Don't you get smart with me, Colonel." She spat my rank like it was an insult. "I am the president of this community. My decisions are final. That flagpole is not on the approved list. It's too tall. It's the wrong material. And you did not submit an architectural change request form in triplicate." I resisted the urge to sigh. It would have been a sign of weakness, and in any contested battle space, you never cede ground, no matter how small. "There's no need for a form, Brenda, because I am not under your authority. This is my property. The deed is in my name. The survey, which I have a copy of right here," I patted a folder on the table, "clearly shows my property line ending 50 feet from your precious community. I am simply a neighbor." "You are a nuisance," she shrieked, "and you will comply. If that hole isn't filled in and that pole isn't removed from my site by tomorrow morning, I will begin fining you $500 a day. And when you don't pay, and you won't, I will put a lien on your house so fast it'll make your head spin." The threat hung in the air, heavy and stupid. A lien on a property she had no legal connection to. It was like a child threatening to take away a grown-up's car keys. The sheer, unadulterated ignorance of it was breathtaking. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. The peaceful retiree who just wanted to watch the birds and feel the sun on his face receded. 30 years of training, of planning, of executing complex operations in the face of illogical, often hostile opposition came surging to the front. A familiar calm settled over me, the kind that always precedes a difficult mission. The objective had just been clarified. The enemy had declared her intent. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a campaign. I looked at her, at this petty tyrant in her pink tracksuit, and I saw not a neighbor, but a strategic problem to be dismantled. Objective identified, a voice in the back of my head said, a voice that had been quiet for the past 6 months. Theater of Operations, Bayside Meadows. Enemy Force, 1, HOA. President, Brenda Miller. Mission, complete and total neutralization of threat. Rules of engagement, legal, methodical, and absolute. I gave her a small, tight smile. You do what you feel you have to, Brenda. She stared at me, momentarily thrown by my lack of outrage. She expected a shouting match. She thrived on it. I was denying her the fuel. I will, she finally sputtered, puffing herself up again. You'll see. You'll be sorry you ever crossed me. She turned on her heel, her sneakers squeaking on the pavement, and stomped back toward the manicured sign that read, Bayside Meadows, a community of distinction. I watched her go. I picked up my coffee mug. It was cold now. The battle had begun, and I had every intention of winning it. Hey everyone, and welcome. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA, a petty bureaucrat who thinks their tiny bit of authority makes them a king or queen, then you're going to want to hear this. This story is for anyone who believes in the simple right to be left alone on their own property. It's about how a little bit of methodical planning and a deep respect for the law can dismantle a tyrant's paper castle, brick by imaginary brick. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because you won't want to miss how this plays out. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your own HOA nightmare story is. It's good to know you're not alone in the fight. Now let me tell you how this all started. Retirement is a funny thing. For 30 years, my world had been a symphony of diesel engines, helicopter blades, engineering schematics, and the crisp, formal language of military command. I was Colonel John Sterling of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. My job was to build things: bridges, airfields, forward operating bases, water purification systems, in places where people were actively trying to unbuild them. I thrived on order, precision, and overcoming complex logistical challenges. My life was a series of plans, executed under pressure. But after 3 decades, the pressure wears you down. The plans start to blur together. I was tired, not of the work, but of the constant churn, the moving, the dust of a dozen different countries that never quite washed out of your clothes or your soul. My wife Martha had passed away 5 years prior, and the constant deployments had felt different after that, lonelier. The structure that had defined my life started to feel more like a cage. I wanted peace. I wanted stillness. I wanted a place to plant my feet and not have to pull them up again in 6 months. So, I retired. Full honors, a nice pension, and a flag presented to me by a general I deeply respected. The flag that now lay waiting beside the hole in my lawn. My search for a final posting, a permanent home, took me 6 months. I didn't want a sterile box in a gated community. I wanted land. I wanted trees that were older than I was. I wanted the sound of wind, not traffic. I found it in a 5-acre plot on the Maryland coast. It was a beautiful piece of land, mostly wooded, with a small, sturdy house set well back from the road. The property's main selling point, for me, was that it bordered a state preserve on one side and a quiet estuary on the other. It was an island of green. The third side of my property, however, abutted the back end of a housing development called Bayside Meadows. When my realtor showed me the place, he was upfront about it. "That's an HOA community over there," he'd said, pointing through the trees. "But this property is grandfathered. It was here long before they built that place. You're not part of it. No fees, no rules. You're completely independent." That was music to my ears. I'd spent my life in a world of rules, and while I respected them, I had no desire to enter a new one governed by regulations about the acceptable shade of beige for a mailbox. I checked the deed, the county plat maps, and the title history myself. He was right. My 5 acres were a sovereign nation, legally and historically distinct from the sea of identical houses next door. I bought it without a second thought. For the first 6 months, it was paradise. I spent my days clearing brush, establishing walking trails through my little patch of woods, and identifying bird species. The quiet was profound. The loudest sounds were the cawing of crows and the distant hum of a boat on the bay. I met a few of my Bayside Meadows neighbors on my walks. They were mostly pleasant people, a young family, a few other retirees. They seemed a bit subdued, almost timid, but I chalked it up to the quiet nature of the place. Then I decided to install my flagpole. It was more than just a piece of hardware to me. That flag had been earned, not just by me, but by every soldier I ever served with. It represented a lifetime of service. I wanted to see it flying, crisp and proud, against the blue Maryland sky. It was a connection to my past, a symbol of the country I'd spent my life defending. It felt like the final act of settling in, of truly coming home. I did my due diligence the way I was trained. I researched local and state ordinances. A flagpole under a certain height, 25 feet in my county, required no permit on residential property. Mine was 20 feet. I wasn't digging near any buried utilities. I'd called 811 to have them marked just in case. I was 100% within my legal rights. So I bought the kit, dug the hole for the concrete footing, and prepared to give my flag its place of honor. That was when I first summoned the beast. My digging apparently had been spotted by a Bayside resident and reported. 2 days after I dug the hole, I got my first visit from Brenda Miller. It was a reconnaissance mission on her part. She'd rolled up in a golf cart with HOA President stenciled on the side, her eyes scanning my property like a predator assessing a new feeding ground. She asked me what I was doing. I told her politely. A flicker of something, part hunger, part fury, flashed in her eyes. She informed me that flagpoles were strictly regulated and that I would need to submit a proposal. I explained, just as politely, that her regulations didn't apply to me. I showed her a copy of my survey map. It was like showing a cat a calculus textbook. She didn't understand it, and more importantly, she didn't want to understand it. Any information that contradicted her authority was simply discarded. She left in a huff, muttering about rules being rules. That had been a week ago. Her verbal barrage this morning was the official declaration of war. After she stomped away, I finished my now cold coffee and went inside. The anger I should have felt simply wasn't there. Instead, there was a cold, clear sense of purpose. This wasn't about a flagpole anymore. This was about a fundamental principle, the right to be left in peace. Brenda Miller had encroached upon that right. She had crossed a line, not a property line, but a line of personal sovereignty. She would be dealt with. I went to my office, a spare bedroom I'd converted with bookshelves, a large oak desk, and my old ergonomic chair from my final command post. I opened a clean document on my computer and typed at the top, Operation Old Glory. Beneath it, I began to lay out a plan of action. Phase 1, documentation. Phase 2, fortification. Phase 3, counteroffensive. This was a language I understood. This was a problem with a solution. Brenda Miller had no idea who she had just picked a fight with. She thought she was dealing with another cowed resident. She was, in fact, dealing with a man who had planned the construction of a 2-mile runway on a swamp in a hurricane zone. Her little HOA was about to experience a level of strategic planning it was profoundly unprepared for. The first official salvo arrived 3 days later, just as I knew it would. It wasn't hand-delivered by a screeching harpy in a golf cart. This was designed to look formal, official, intimidating. It came via certified mail, a classic move to make the recipient feel like they're already in legal trouble. I signed for the envelope from the mail carrier with a grim sense of satisfaction. The envelope itself was a piece of work. It was made of a heavy, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of thing people use for wedding invitations. In the top left corner, embossed in gold foil, was a pompous-looking crest featuring a seagull and a crab, circled by the words, Bayside Meadows Homeowners Association. It was absurdly overwrought. I didn't open it immediately. I walked back to my office, laid the unopened envelope on my desk, and retrieved the item I had purchased the day before from an office supply store, a heavy-duty 3-inch D-ring binder. It was stark white. On the spine, using a label maker, I had already printed the words, Operation Old Glory. I 3-hole punched the certified mail receipt and the green return receipt card I had signed and placed them as the first page in the binder. Then, with a letter opener, I slit the cream-colored envelope with surgical precision. Inside was a single sheet of matching cardstock. The letterhead was the same as the envelope, gold crest and all. The text was printed in a florid, cursive font that was difficult to read. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive nonsense. Dear property owner at 112 Osprey Lane, it began, already establishing a cold, impersonal distance. It has come to the attention of the Bayside Meadows Architectural Review Committee that an unapproved structural modification is in progress at the aforementioned property. Specifically, the installation of a non-compliant vertical mast structure, that is, flagpole. I had to admire the jargon. Vertical mast structure. Brenda had clearly spent some time with a thesaurus. As per the Bayside Meadows Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, CC&Rs, Article 12, Section C, Paragraph 4, all exterior structures, including but not limited to flagpoles, must be pre-approved by the committee. The structure in question is in violation on multiple points. It exceeds the maximum allowable height of 8 feet. It is not of the approved bronze finish aluminum, and no architectural change request, ACR, form was submitted for review. The letter went on in this vein for 2 more paragraphs, a dense forest of bylaws and invented authority. Then came the punchline. You are hereby notified that a fine of $500 has been levied against your property. A further fine of $500 will be assessed for each day the violation remains uncorrected. To cure this violation, you must immediately cease all construction, remove the offending structure and all related materials, and restore the landscape to its original condition. Failure to comply within 10 business days will result in the matter being turned over to our legal counsel for the purpose of placing a lien on your property and pursuing all other available remedies. It was signed in a spiky, aggressive scrawl, Brenda Miller, President, Bayside Meadows HOA, with the names of her board members, her cronies, listed beneath it in type. Instead of anger, I felt a surge of what I can only describe as professional enthusiasm. This was the hostile intent document. It was a clear, unambiguous statement of her position and her threatened actions. It was perfect. I carefully placed the letter in a plastic sheet protector, 3-hole punched it, and clipped it into the binder behind the postal receipts. Then I turned to my computer. It was time for Phase 1, Part 2, the measured response. I drafted my letter on plain white paper with a simple, block font letterhead containing my name and address. I addressed it directly to Brenda Miller and the Board of Directors, Bayside Meadows HOA. My response was polite, firm, and factual. It was structured like a mission brief. Subject: your letter dated date regarding my property at 112 Osprey Lane. Dear Ms. Miller and board members, I began, I am in receipt of your correspondence dated date, which I received via certified mail on date. I am writing to formally respond. Paragraph 1 was a simple statement of fact. The property located at 112 Osprey Lane is not, and has never been, a part of the Bayside Meadows development or subject to its homeowners association or its covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Your own records, as well as the official plat maps filed with Somerset County, will confirm this. Paragraph 2 was a direct rebuttal of her claims. As my property is not within your jurisdiction, your rules regarding structure height, material, or the requirement for an architectural change request are not applicable. Your attempt to levy fines against my property is legally baseless and constitutes harassment. For paragraph 3, I attached a high-quality copy of the county survey map with my property outlined in red and the Bayside Meadows development in blue. I also included a copy of the first page of my property deed. For your reference, I have attached a copy of the official county survey and my deed, which clearly delineate the boundaries of our respective properties. As you can see, your authority ends at the tree line, approximately 50 feet east of my current project. The final paragraph was the fortification phase. Please consider this letter my formal notice to you and the entire board to cease and desist all attempts to assert authority over my property, all baseless threats of fines and legal action, and all forms of contact that could be construed as harassment. Any further such attempts will be documented and forwarded to my legal counsel. I trust this clarifies the matter completely. I signed it. Sincerely, John Sterling, Colonel, U.S. Army, retired. I printed 3 copies. One for my binder, one to send, and one just in case. I walked the letter to the post office that afternoon and sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested. The little green card would be her confirmation that she had received my warning shot. The ball was back in her court. I knew, of course, that she would ignore it. Tyrants like Brenda don't respond to logic or evidence. They only understand power. My letter wasn't really for her. It was for the record. It was another page in the binder. It was laying the groundwork for the kill box I was building. Every piece of paper, every receipt, every documented interaction was another brick in the wall of her eventual defeat. The days ticked by. I didn't touch the flagpole or the hole. I left them exactly as they were, a silent challenge. I was creating a static target, daring her to make the next move. And, right on schedule, she did. Exactly 10 business days after I sent my letter, another cream-colored envelope arrived. This one was angrier. The cursive font seemed sharper, the language more strident. Brenda's signature looked like she'd carved it into the paper with a knife. The letter acknowledged receipt of my so-called evidence, but dismissed it as irrelevant. Her argument, as far as I could decipher its rambling, pseudo-legal prose, had now evolved. She claimed that a visual easement existed, and that because my flagpole would be part of the Bayside Meadows visual landscape, it fell under their control. A visual easement is not a real thing. She had either made it up completely or disastrously misunderstood a tangentially related legal concept. It was a fiction built to justify her lust for control. The letter cheerfully informed me that my initial fine of $500 had now ballooned to $5,500, with the daily $500 fines continuing to accrue. Your failure to comply is only increasing your liability, she wrote, with what I could only imagine was a smug grin. We have instructed our attorneys to begin the lien process immediately. This was the escalation I had been waiting for. She was moving from empty threats to action, or at least the threat of action. Filing a fraudulent lien is a serious matter. It's slander of title, and it can have significant legal consequences for the filer. She was walking deeper into the trap. I filed her letter in the binder, right behind the delivery confirmation for my own letter. The narrative was building beautifully. My binder was getting heavier. It was a satisfying feeling. Now it was time to move from the passive phase of documentation to the active phase of reconnaissance and fortification. My next step wasn't to write another letter to Brenda. That was pointless. My next step was to go over her head, way over her head. I spent the next 2 days in my office, not with anger, but with a quiet, focused intensity of a research analyst. I wasn't just looking at local property law anymore. Brenda's specific target, an American flag, was a critical error on her part. She could have picked a fight over a shed, or a fence, or a satellite dish, but she chose the flag. And in doing so, she had unwittingly brought a much bigger player onto the field. My research led me to Public Law 109-243. It's more commonly known as the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005. I read the entire text of the law, then read it again. It was signed by President George W. Bush, and its language was simple, direct, and powerful. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that a condominium association, cooperative association, or residential real estate management association may not adopt or enforce any policy that would restrict or prevent a member of the association from displaying the flag of the United States on residential property. Now, I knew what Brenda's argument would be. I wasn't a member, but the spirit of the law was clear. It was designed to prevent exactly this kind of petty tyranny over the display of the national flag. More importantly, it established a federal interest in the matter. This wasn't just a local spat anymore. I printed out the full text of the law, highlighted the key passages, and added it to the binder as Tab A, Legal Precedents. This was the legal smoking gun. Her bylaws, even if they did apply to me, were in direct conflict with federal law. Any attempt to enforce them was illegal. My next step was to engage higher authorities. I didn't call a lawyer yet. That was for the counter-offensive phase. First, I needed to get other official entities on the record. I made 2 calls. The first was to my congressman's local office. I explained the situation calmly and factually to a young aide. I wasn't an angry constituent yelling into the phone. I was a retired colonel presenting a clear-cut case of a homeowners association attempting to illegally prohibit the display of the American flag. I mentioned the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act. The aide, who had probably been dealing with UFO sightings and complaints about potholes all day, suddenly sounded very interested. "She's trying to stop you from flying the flag?" he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. "And your property isn't even in the HOA?" "That is correct," I said. He took down all my information, including Brenda's name and the HOA's address. "Colonel, I can't make any promises, but the congressman takes this sort of thing very, very seriously. Let me talk to his chief of staff. We will absolutely be looking into this." He promised to get back to me. My second call was to a contact I still had at the Department of Veterans Affairs. While they had no direct jurisdiction, they had resources and a vested interest in protecting veterans' rights. I explained the situation again. The woman I spoke to was incandescent with rage on my behalf. She connected me to a veterans advocacy group that specialized in legal aid and disputes with HOAs. They were thrilled to hear about it. They'd seen this before, but my case, where the HOA had zero jurisdiction to begin with, was, in their words, a slam dunk. They asked me to keep them apprised and offered to provide legal support if needed. These calls were crucial. I was no longer a lone individual fighting a battle. I was now a citizen with the documented interest of a congressional office and a national advocacy group. I wrote up detailed memoranda of both phone calls, including the date, time, and the names of the people I spoke with, and filed them in the binder. The final part of the reconnaissance phase was to gather local intelligence. It was time to build a resistance. I spent the next week taking walks in the evenings, not on my own property, but through the streets of Bayside Meadows. I was careful to be friendly and approachable. I struck up conversations with people out walking their dogs or watering their lawns. At first, people were guarded, but when I mentioned I was the guy with the flagpole issue, their eyes would light up with a kind of pained recognition. It turned out I wasn't Brenda's only target. I was just the first one who was in a position to fight back effectively. I met a man named Tom, a retired Marine sergeant who had served 2 tours in Iraq. Brenda was fining him $200 a month because the small "Support Our Troops" yellow ribbon magnet on his mailbox was an unapproved adornment. He'd been fighting her for 6 months, writing letters, going to board meetings, but he was getting worn down. I met an elderly widow named Mrs. Gable. Her passion was her rose garden, which was truly spectacular. Brenda had cited her for having non-native flora and for her flowers being excessively vibrant, which apparently disrupted the neighborhood's subdued color palette. Another family was being harassed because their children's plastic playset in their own backyard was visible over the fence line and was, according to Brenda, an eyesore. The stories were all the same: petty, vindictive, and an abuse of power. Brenda ruled by fear and attrition, levying fines until people just gave up and complied. They were afraid of the legal threats, of the liens she was so fond of promising. I listened patiently to each story. I took notes. I asked for copies of the violation letters they had received. Most were happy to provide them. I told them what I was doing, that I was building a case, and that her authority was not as absolute as she pretended. For the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in their eyes. Tom, the Marine, clapped me on the shoulder. "Give her hell, Colonel," he said, a grim smile on his face. "We're all behind you." I now had allies. Their stories, their violation letters, all went into the binder. It was no longer just about my flagpole. It was about liberating an entire community from a petty dictator. The scope of the mission had expanded. The binder was now nearly 4 inches thick. It was a dense, heavy, and beautiful thing. It was a weapon, loaded and ready. Now, all I needed was to hire the gunner and wait for the enemy to make her final, critical mistake. The time had bring in legal firepower. My reconnaissance phase was complete, my initial alliances formed. I wasn't looking for just any lawyer. I needed someone who would appreciate the methodical, military-style preparation I had undertaken. I found him through an old friend from the JAG Corps. His name was David Henderson, a retired Army major who now ran a private practice specializing in property and contract law. His office was neat, orderly, and unpretentious. He had a firm handshake and eyes that didn't miss a thing. I didn't give him a long, rambling story. I simply walked in, set the 4-inch binder on his desk with a solid, satisfying thud, and said, "Major, I have a situation I believe you'll find well documented." He flipped open the binder. He didn't start at the front. He thumbed through the tabs, his eyes scanning the contents. Correspondence log, photographic evidence, legal precedents, county records, witness statements. A slow smile spread across his face. "Colonel," he said, looking up at me, "this isn't a case file. This is a prosecutor's dream. It's a kill box. You've done 90% of my job for me." He spent the next hour poring over the contents. He read Brenda's letters, my responses, the certified mail receipts. He chuckled when he got to her visual easement theory. When he read the full text of the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act under Tab A, he laughed out loud. "She picked a fight over the flag with a retired colonel who isn't even in her HOA," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "The sheer hubris is magnificent. And the fraudulent lien threat? That's slander of title. That's actionable. We can sue her and the HOA for damages." He agreed to take the case on the spot. His first official act was to draft a letter. It was a work of art, a masterpiece of legal threat. It was addressed to Brenda, her board, and Bayside Meadows legal counsel. It cited property law, federal law, and multiple torts, including harassment and slander of title. It demanded they immediately retract all fines, issue a formal written apology, and sign a legally binding agreement to never contact me again. It gave them 5 business days to comply, or we would file a lawsuit seeking actual and punitive damages. Like my own letter, it was sent certified mail. We now had a lawyer on the record, officially representing my interests. The trap was fully set. Brenda, true to form, was not intimidated. She was enraged. Her critical error, the one that would spring the trap, came just 3 days after she received Henderson's letter. It was a Tuesday morning. I was on my porch, enjoying the quiet, the binder sitting on the table next to me like a faithful guard dog. Around 9 a.m., a large beat-up Ford F-250, rumbling with a bad muffler, pulled up and parked on the street right at the edge of my property. The doors were emblazoned with a crudely painted logo, Brenda's Bayside Landscaping and Removal. My heart didn't race. Instead, a profound sense of calm washed over me. The target is entering the kill zone. Two large, sullen-looking men got out. One was carrying a shovel, the other a post-hole digger. They looked at the hole in my lawn, looked at the flagpole lying beside it, and then looked at a piece of paper in their hands, which I presumed was a work order. I didn't move from my chair. I simply picked up my phone, unlocked it, and hit the record button, making sure it was clearly visible in my hand. Then I picked up the folder from the table that contained a copy of my property survey. The two men started walking onto my lawn. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice calm and carrying easily in the quiet air. They stopped, surprised. They clearly hadn't expected me to be sitting right there. "We've got a work order to, fill this hole and remove this pole," the one with the shovel said, gesturing vaguely. "I see," I replied, still seated. "Could I ask who issued that work order?" "Brenda Miller, the HOA lady," he grunted. "Thank you for confirming that," I said smoothly. "Now I need to inform you of a few things before you take another step. First, you are currently trespassing on private property. This land is not part of the Bayside Meadows HOA. I stood up slowly and walked to the edge of my porch, holding the survey map. This document is the official county survey. As you can see, the property line is the street. By walking onto my lawn, you have already broken the law." They looked at each other, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. "Second," I continued, holding up my phone, "I am recording this entire interaction. Your faces, your truck, your license plate, and your admission that you are here on Brenda Miller's orders are all being recorded as evidence." The one with the post-hole digger shuffled his feet. "Hey man, we're just doing our job." "I understand that," I said, my tone still reasonable, "and I am trying to help you avoid becoming accessories to a crime. If you proceed to dig, fill, or touch anything on my property, I will not only have you charged with criminal trespass, but also with destruction of property. Brenda Miller is currently the subject of a pending lawsuit for her harassment concerning this exact spot. Your actions here would make you and your company co-defendants in that suit. My lawyer, Major David Henderson, would be very interested to know your names." I held out one of Henderson's business cards. "Here is his card. I suggest you call him before you do anything else. Or better yet, I suggest you get back in your truck and leave." The foreman looked at the business card, then at my phone, then at my face. He saw no anger, no fear. He saw a man who was completely in control of the situation, a man who had all his facts in a row. He was a hired hand, not an ideologue. This paycheck wasn't worth a court date. All right, he mumbled, backing away. "Forget it." He and his partner turned, walked back to their truck without another word, tossed their tools in the back, and drove away with a squeal of tires. The entire encounter lasted less than 5 minutes. I stopped the recording and saved the video. It was the physical evidence I needed. Brenda had now moved from harassment and illegal threats to actively dispatching agents to trespass and damage my property. She had crossed the final line. I immediately sent the video file to Henderson. His reply came back in minutes. "Christmas came early this year. This is beautiful, John. Just beautiful." This event was the catalyst that galvanized the rebellion. That evening, I called Tom, the Marine Sergeant, and Mrs. Gable, the Rose Gardener. I invited them to my house. I showed them the video of the standoff. When Tom saw the Brenda's Bayside landscaping truck, he snorted. That's her brother-in-law's company. She gives him all the HOA contracts. No bid, of course. The fear they had lived with for so long was visibly burning away, replaced by cold, hard anger. Seeing Brenda's tactics fail so spectacularly against a prepared opponent gave them courage. My solitary fight was now officially a popular uprising. The final piece of the puzzle, the kill shot, fell into my lap 2 days later. It came from an unexpected source, a discreet email from a man named Frank Peterson. He introduced himself as the former treasurer of the Bayside Meadows HOA. He had resigned in protest 2 months ago over Brenda's financial irregularities, but had kept his own copies of the records, just in case. He'd heard about my fight and decided it was time to act. Attached to the email was a password-protected file. He gave me the password over the phone. It was tyranny. Inside the file were the HOA's complete financial statements for the past 2 years. Bank statements, credit card bills, check registers, and Frank had helpfully highlighted the questionable items. It was a goldmine of corruption. There were thousands of dollars in payments to Brenda's Bayside Landscaping for jobs that were never done. There were charges on the HOA credit card for expensive dinners, for new patio furniture for Brenda's own backyard, listed as community area improvements, and most damningly, a check for $2,500 made out to the law firm that had been sending her threatening letters, noted in the memo line as legal fees, 112 Osprey Lane. She was using the HOA member's own money to pay her lawyer to harass and threaten someone who wasn't even in the HOA. I forwarded the file to Henderson. His response was a single word: checkmate. He told me to call for an emergency HOA meeting. The bylaws allowed it if a certain percentage of homeowners signed a petition. With my new alliance, we had the signatures within 24 hours. The meeting was set for the following Wednesday. The stage was set for the public coup. The community clubhouse was packed. I had never seen it so full. Word had spread like wildfire. The air was thick with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something new: defiance. Tom and Mrs. Gable sat in the front row with me, along with a dozen other residents who had been emboldened to join our cause. My lawyer, David Henderson, sat beside me, calm and composed, a leather briefcase resting on his lap. At the front of the room, Brenda Miller sat at a long table with her 2 cronies, the remaining board members. She looked flustered by the massive turnout, but her expression was one of defiant arrogance. She held a small wooden gavel in her hand like a scepter, a symbol of an authority she believed was absolute. "This emergency meeting will now come to order," she announced, her voice tight. She banged the gavel on the table, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "The floor is open. The petition cited concerns about association management, a very vague complaint. Who wishes to speak?" I stood up. "I do," I said, my voice even and clear. Brenda's eyes locked onto mine, filled with venom. "You are not a member of this association. You have no right to speak here." "On the contrary, Brenda," Henderson said, standing up beside me. "My client, Colonel Sterling, is the subject of this meeting. You have made him the subject by using association funds to illegally harass him. Therefore, he has standing. Furthermore, I have with me proxies from 22 dues-paying members of this association, granting Colonel Sterling the right to speak on their behalf. He will speak." A murmur went through the crowd. Brenda's face went from red to a pale, mottled white. She had been outmaneuvered before the battle had even begun. She looked at her cronies for support, but they just stared down at the table, avoiding her gaze. She slumped back in her chair. "Fine," she hissed. "Speak." That was my cue. I walked to the front of the room where a projector and screen had been set up at my request. I inserted a flash drive into the laptop. The first image that appeared on the screen was a large, clear map of the Bayside Meadows development in my adjoining property. "Good evening," I began, addressing the crowd, not Brenda. "My name is John Sterling. For the past month, your HOA president, Ms. Miller, has been engaged in a campaign of harassment and illegal financial threats against me. This campaign was based on her assertion that she has authority over my property. As you can see from this official county plat map, she does not." I clicked to the next slide. It was a copy of her first violation letter, the one with the $500 fine. "She has attempted to fine me, as of today, over $15,000. A collective gasp went through the room. "She has threatened to place a fraudulent lien on my property, an act which constitutes slander of title under Maryland law," I continued, my voice steady. "And she did all of this because I, a private citizen on my own private property, chose to erect a flagpole to fly the flag of the United States." I clicked again. The text of the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act filled the screen. "This is federal law. It expressly forbids associations like yours from restricting the display of the American flag. So even if I were a member of your HOA, her actions would be illegal." Brenda started banging her gavel. "This is out of order. This is a private matter between—" "It stopped being a private matter, Ms. Miller," Henderson cut in, his voice like ice, "the moment you hired a law firm using HOA funds to pursue your personal vendetta." That landed like a physical blow. The room erupted in chatter. "That's a lie," Brenda shrieked. "Is it?" I said calmly, and clicked to the next slide. It was a high-resolution scan of the check from the Bayside Meadows HOA account, made out to her lawyers. The memo line, "Legal fees, 112 Osprey Lane," was circled in red. Silence. A deep, profound, and damning silence. Everyone in the room was staring at the screen, then at Brenda. Her face had crumpled. That's a clerical error," she stammered. "Then let's look at a few more clerical errors," I said. The coordinated attack was now in full swing. One by one, I clicked through the slides. The HOA credit card statement showing a $400 dinner at a fancy steakhouse. The invoice from Brenda's Bayside Landscaping, owned by her brother-in-law, as Tom shouted from the audience, for shrubbery replacement on a street that had no shrubs. The receipt for over $2,000 worth of community patio furniture that was currently sitting on Brenda's private, screened-in porch. With each slide, the anger in the room grew. It was becoming a low growl. This wasn't about a flagpole anymore. This was about them, their money, their trust. Now it was time for the allies to press the attack. "She's been fining me for 6 months for a yellow ribbon magnet on my mailbox." Tom stood up and yelled, his voice resonating with righteous fury. "Is that where my $500 went, Brenda? To your steak dinner?" Mrs. Gable stood up, her voice trembling but firm. "She threatened to rip out my prize-winning roses. My late husband planted those roses." One after another, a dozen residents stood up, sharing their own stories of petty harassment, of absurd fines, of her reign of terror. The chorus of dissent was overwhelming. Brenda's implosion was swift and total. She lost all composure, screaming that they were all liars, that she was the president, that they had to listen to her. She banged her gavel over and over, a frantic, useless rhythm against the tide of rebellion. The sound was pathetic, the desperate act of a monarch whose crown was melting. Finally, Henderson stood up, and the room fell silent again. "Under the bylaws of this association," he announced, his voice booming, "a motion can be made for a vote of no confidence and the immediate removal of the board for gross financial mismanagement and malfeasance. Is there such a motion?" "I so move," Tom shouted. "I second the motion," Mrs. Gable cried out. "The motion has been made and seconded," Henderson declared, looking directly at Brenda. A vote is required. All in favor of removing Brenda Miller and the current board from office, say aye. The roar that filled that room was deafening. It was a primal scream of liberation, a tidal wave of voices united in purpose. Aye. All opposed? Henderson asked into the thunder. Silence, not a single voice. Not even Brenda's cronies dared to speak. The motion carries, Henderson said simply. Brenda Miller, you are hereby removed from the presidency and the board, effective immediately. Please vacate the chair. The humiliation was absolute. Stripped of her power in a public forum, defeated by the very people she had terrorized, Brenda Miller stared out at the sea of hostile faces. Her face was a mask of disbelief and pure, undiluted hatred. She threw the gavel down on the table, where it bounced and clattered to the floor. Without another word, she grabbed her purse, pushed through the crowd near the door, and fled the clubhouse into the night. She was no longer a queen in her castle. She was just a disgraced woman in a cheap tracksuit. The aftermath was swift and cleansing. In the vacuum of power left by Brenda's spectacular exit, the community rallied. That same night, an interim board was elected on the spot. The new president? Tom, the Marine sergeant. His first act was to call a motion to void every fine levied by Brenda in the past year. It passed unanimously. His second was to issue a formal, public apology to me and to every other resident who had been harassed. The healing of the community began almost immediately. The oppressive atmosphere of fear lifted like a fog. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had been pitted against one another by Brenda's tactics were now united. The following weekend, there was a neighborhood-wide barbecue. It was the first one in years. For Brenda, the reckoning was severe and multifaceted. Henderson, on behalf of the HOA's new board, filed a civil lawsuit against her to recover the misappropriated funds. The evidence from my binder, the financial records leaked by Frank, the invoices from her brother-in-law, was undeniable. The court ordered her to repay over $50,000 to the association. But it didn't end there. Based on the evidence of fraud and embezzlement, the state's attorney's office launched a criminal investigation. Brenda was charged with multiple counts of felony theft. Faced with a mountain of evidence, she pleaded guilty. She avoided jail time but was sentenced to 5 years of probation and a massive amount of community service. The financial ruin and public disgrace were too much. A for sale sign appeared on her lawn within a month of the HOA meeting. Her house, the command center of her fallen empire, was sold to a young family who promptly installed a large, colorful playset in the backyard. Brenda Miller vanished from Bayside Meadows, a disgraced ghost, a cautionary tale. As for me, the day after the meeting, I mixed a bag of concrete and set my flagpole firmly in the ground. I waited for the concrete to cure. Then, on a bright, clear Saturday morning, I attached the clips to my retirement flag. With Tom and Mrs. Gable and a few other neighbors watching from my driveway, I raised the stars and stripes to the top of the 20-foot pole. It caught the breeze and unfurled, snapping smartly against the blue sky. It was beautiful. I live in a different neighborhood now, not physically, of course. I'm still in my house, on my 5 acres of peace. But the community next door has been transformed. The timid, subdued residents are gone, replaced by friendly, open neighbors. Tom runs the HOA with a light touch and common sense. Mrs. Gable's roses have won another blue ribbon at the county fair. The yellow ribbons, the playsets, they are all still there. The neighborhood feels alive. Sometimes when I'm sitting on my porch with my morning coffee, I look at my flag flying proudly, and I think about the nature of the fight. It was never about a piece of aluminum pipe. It was about the simple, fundamental principle that a person's home is their sanctuary. It was about the fact that authority, without accountability and the consent of the governed, is just tyranny. Brenda's mistake was that she saw rules not as a framework for community, but as a weapon for control. She believed her power was inherent in her title. What she failed to understand is that true power doesn't come from a gavel or an embossed letterhead. It comes from respect, from reason, and when necessary, from a well-documented, meticulously organized 4-inch binder. It's the triumph of truth and documentation over petty tyranny. And it's the simple, hard-won right to be left in peace.